Okay, with that, we'll have Ms. Mills come up and present the remaining portion of her PowerPoint presentation. Yes, please do.
Good morning. So, we left off on the appraisal process last week, and I'm just going to move forward in this PowerPoint until we get to the right spot. I think there's another way to do this. I'm sorry. But okay. So, I tabulated the number of appeals that we have reported to us by the County Board of Assessors in 2017. And as you can see in this PowerPoint, I'm on page 9 of the handout. 109,100 appeals. I think that could be a volatile number, though, because as counties do reevaluations, they tend to follow a 3-year cycle, and when they do reevaluations, you could get into a reval year for DeKalb or Fulton or Gwinnett, and that number is probably going to jump up significantly. So I can't remember. 2016 was not a reval year for Fulton, for example. 2016 was their reval year, so I think probably a better example of the number of appeals, or an average number, would be to get at least a 3-year span or a 3-year average. But at any rate, this gives you an idea of what the county appraisers are appraising, and they're appraising real and personal property and mobile homes on that tax digest, and those are 100% numbers there, and 4.4 million parcels of real property, and the total value of all the property that was under appeal in 2017 as reported by the assessor. So $109,000, $62 billion in value under appeal, but that's not value in dispute. Value in dispute is a much smaller number, but that's just the total value of the property that was under appeal. Now the tax commissioner is going to value the heavy-duty equipment. That's just the way that code section works. It's a very specific class of motor vehicle, and there's a mathematical formula for that first year of purchase of that heavy-duty equipment, and then generally also the harvested timber value, because the definition of value for that class of property is basically its purchase price, with the exception of the owner harvested timber, and then we provide the values for that. The Revenue Department does. And then, of course, the Revenue Department is producing the Motor Vehicle Assessment Manual to come up with the values of motor vehicle. That's not including TIVT. TIVT is outside of the tax digest. This is just the stuff that hangs on into the old birthday tax. And then we do the public utility valuations and provide that to the county for inclusion on their tax digest. But the interesting thing is any of this can be appealed to the local board of assessors, so they may have to handle a motor vehicle appeal. In some cases, regarding level of assessment, they might have to handle a public utility appeal. And of course, on the owner harvest timber or the timber value or the heavy duty or any of that, they can handle an appeal on it. Overwhelmingly, they don't have a lot of appeals on that, but they could. And then this is just very simple spreadsheet of, the appeal goes to the Board of Assessors first. Basically, they get a review process, and then, if they can't come to terms on a value with the Board of Assessors, it goes on to the method chosen by the taxpayer, Board of Equalization, hearing officer, or arbitration. Now, the next slide you can't read up here, but there is a handout if everyone had a copy of that. You can't read. Well, you know what? I didn't even condense it all. This is the summary. And this code section is probably about 30 pages long, and I condensed it to 12 on my cheat sheet here. So what I did is I took the code section and kind of cut and pasted into a Word document, and then I created an outline just so I could speak about it. But you kind of can follow along with that handout because, again, it's just a summary of the appeal process. But my major points that I'd like to share with you is, first of all, there is an appeal administrator designated now. This is relatively new in the code section, and that is the Clerk of Superior Court. And that appeal administrator is charged with furnishing the Board of Equalization and the arbitrator and the hearing officer with facilities and administrative help. And that clerk of court is very valuable in getting taxpayers through that appeal process. That, yes.
Chatham County, that's working very well.
Yes, I think it works very well statewide, yes.
And by that, Mr. Powers, let me just turn the mic on so folks can hear you. Is that, are you 7 or 8? 7. So when you say it's working well, what do you mean?
Very streamlined.
In that having the clerk's office do it is working well.
Yes.
And before that, how was it working?
Well, obviously not as well.
Not as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
it was run through the assessor's office before. Is that
right. It was through the grand jury, through appointments to the Superior Court.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. I think statewide, the appeal administrators are doing a great job. Now, they get a line item budget. The code actually requires that they get a line item budget for administrating the appeals. And they can also receive complaints about the Board of Equalization from taxpayers if, that Board of Equalization were unprofessional. And the appeal administrator would forward that complaint to the grand jury, who would do an investigation and could potentially remove someone who didn't act professionally. Regarding, so the appeal administrator is basically overseeing the administration. They don't really get involved in the appeal process itself or the appeal outcomes, but they just oversee the administration to make sure everything flows well. The Revenue Department's duties in the appeal process is to create uniform forms for appealing and the notifications that the tax assessor has to provide to the taxpayer or the appellant. The commissioner also is required to produce uniform procedures and standards through regulation on how the appeal process should be, or the appeal hearing should go. In addition, the third thing is the Revenue Department has to train the boards of equalization and the hearing officers. So, appeal administrator, Georgia Department of Revenue, and then my next point would be the appeals process generally that apply to all processes, the Board of Equalization hearing, the arbitration hearing, and hearing officer. So any taxpayer who receives a notice of assessment from the Board of Assessors can appeal that notice of assessment within 45 days of the date of that notice. They can appeal to the Board of Equalization regarding taxability, uniformity of assessment, value, or denial of exemptions. They can appeal to an arbitration, which is a non-binding arbitration on value, or hearing officer on value or uniformity of real property that's valued at no greater than $500,000, and or wireless property, personal property, the aggregate value at no greater than $500,000. By mutual written agreement, the
Ms.
tax.
Mills, do you happen to know kind of what last year, what was the breakdown in terms of the appeals, which way they went, the numbers?
We do post that on our website. We haven't posted it for 2017 yet because we're still compiling that information. It comes in with the 18 digest, but we are compiling that right now. We're handing it off today to someone to start data entering that, and we'll have it on the website soon.
So 2016 data is on the website then?
The 2016 is on the website, right.
All right, thank you.
Taxpayer and the Board of Assessors can mutually agree to bypass Board of Equalization hearing officer arbitration, go directly to Superior Court. And then there's also a provision in the code section that if a city crosses the county line, that a taxpayer can appeal to hearing officer arbitration or Board of Equalization to have that value uniform. In other words, if County A has an assessment ratio of 34 and County B has assessment ratio of 40, the assessor has to make sure that with, you know, the two sides of the city or the city, you know, sides of the county are uniform within that jurisdiction. I think that's a constitutional thing. All taxation shall be uniform within the jurisdiction levying the tax. So they have to make that uniform for that city that crosses county lines. So that's another appeal that could happen.
Thank you. I've been trying to figure out how Atlanta in DeKalb County works. I mean, the properties that are in DeKalb are assessed in DeKalb. Properties in Fulton are assessed in Fulton.
Right.
And if there is a difference, which
They
there
ha-
apparently is,
Right. The code section requires the two assessors to come to terms on what the level of assessment is. So they get to do their individual appraisals, and then, of course, the code says everybody's assessed at 40%. But what if one county is at 34 and the other county is at 40? Well, that's not fair, because they're gonna set that one millage rate for City of Atlanta, and everybody's gonna pay on that one rate, but these people over here at the 34 ratio are gonna get a big deal. So, they have to equalize that ratio, and they did that in 2017. They pass a resolution and say, okay, DeKalb County is lowering, for city purpose only, we're lowering our value, our assessment on our DeKalb County side of Atlanta to equal Fulton, because it would, I guess, be too hard for Fulton to bring it up, so. But it only applies to the city tax, not to the county or the school tax.
thank you. that
Well, in this
helps.
case, it would apply to the school tax as well, because it's a city school.
What a mess.
So an appeal is deemed filed as of the date of the postmark, or the service, the receipt of delivery of statutory overnight service. So it's deemed filed when it's the postmark. Unlike returns or tax payments, which don't have those words in it about when it's deemed received, the appeal code is very specific. When that's postmarked, that's the receive date. So, and that helps people not be late with filing their appeal. Now, taxpayer rights in the appeal process that generally apply across the board to all of the appeal types is that the taxpayer can file this appeal within 45 days, and they're allowed to provide an appraisal that's signed by a certified real property appraiser, and that would be an appraiser certified with the Georgia Real Estate Appraisers Board. And the Board of Assessors shall consider that appraisal upon the taxpayer's request, and within 45 days they have to notify the taxpayer whether or not they accept or reject that appraisal. In addition, the taxpayer can provide to the Board of Assessors, and they must consider the latest sales ratio study performed by the Georgia Department of Audits and Accounts. If more than one property is under appeal, the taxpayer can consolidate those, so they don't have to go to multiple appeal hearings. They can consolidate those into one appeal or one hearing. Also, if an appeal hearing date is scheduled, the taxpayer has the option one time to make a change in the date. The appeal administrator has the authority to give additional extensions if there's good cause. Taxpayers are allowed to make recordings of the appeal hearings, and they're also allowed to interview the assessor's staff or the Board of Assessors regarding their assessment of the property. There's also a penalty for failing on the assessor side for not allowing the taxpayer to get this recording or interview. So taxpayers can, go into the tax office and discuss their assessment with the taxpayer. They can request in writing to have that recorded or to record it. They have to pay for the recording themselves, but, you go back home and you want to know what they really said and kind of sort that out because you didn't catch it all. So they are allowed to interview and they are allowed to record. Now, they have to make a written request, and then, of course, the county wouldn't want to just throw anybody out there to be interviewed. They'd want the person that was the most knowledgeable.
And are they, is the presiding officer or the assessor required to provide documentation about how they reached that assessment value?
They are in notice code, 485306, outside the appeal code. Once they send that notice of assessment to the taxpayer, there's a provision in that code that says the taxpayer may make a written request for all the information that went into making that assessment, and the assessor is supposed to produce that within 10 days. It says in the code 25 cents a copy, but I think the open records code is 10 cents, so we recommend 10 cents, even though the code says 25. It
And
should
does that
probably be
include
corrected.
the comparables, the comps?
Yes, yes. The taxpayer has the right to be represented by an agent, a representative, or an attorney in a tax appeal hearing, but they do need to give the assessors written authority, because you wouldn't want to be discussing someone's, income or, personal property or whatever with someone who wasn't authorized to listen to that. So they do have to give a written authorization for that person to represent them. And also the Board of Equalization or a hearing officer, before they hear an appeal, they're supposed to fill out a disqualification questionnaire to make sure that they don't have any conflicts of interest in listening to that appeal. Within 10 days of the final determination of an appeal, the tax assessor is supposed to forward that final value to the tax commissioner. And that's because the tax commissioner's got a pretty tight limit on getting an additional bill or a refund out to a taxpayer. So the assessor's got 10 days to forward that final value to the tax commissioner, and then the tax commissioner has to react accordingly. Refund with interest is owed in some cases on the appeal, although that interest is limited. And then also, if the appeal outcome creates an additional billing, the taxpayer may have paid on 85% of the value. If it creates an additional billing, the taxpayer gets 60 days to pay without interest, and then after that, the interest kicks in if they're late. So that's generally what happens in all methods of appeal, regardless of what the taxpayer chooses. So when the taxpayer files an appeal, they can use the Department of Revenue's appeal form. We've created a uniform appeal form for use by the taxpayer. The assessor can't change that form. They have to use, it's mandatory that the assessor provide that appeal form. They can't provide any other version of the appeal form, but the taxpayer doesn't have to use it. It's only a may on them to use the form, but it's helpful to them if they do use it, because it helps give the assessor all the information they need to review the property. So the first venue of appeal to talk about is the Board of Equalization, and most appeals go to Board of Equalization. Overwhelmingly, that's how appeals are handled when at first the taxpayer doesn't resolve something with the Board of Assessors. Boards of Equalization are taxpayers in the county. They own property in the county. They generally, very often have served on the grand jury before, and they find out about the Board of Equalization and want to do that as they're getting off the grand jury, but they don't have to be grand jury members. They have 3-year terms, and they have to take training from the Georgia Department of Revenue. That's 40 hours the first year that they're appointed, 8 hours each additional year, and each third year after they're reappointed, 20 hours of training from the Department of Revenue. They have to hear the appeals and determine assessments and a denial of homestead. This venue of appeal handles taxability, value, uniformity, and denial of homestead, denial of exemptions. And so it's able to handle more, a wider variety of the types of things that people appeal. In addition, the County Board of Equalization can require the Board of Assessors to do a partial or complete countywide reevaluation. However, there's some rules on that. They have to have a quorum to do that. All of them have to agree, in other words. The appeal to the Board of Equalization is affected by filing with the County Board of Assessors a notice of appeal. And again, the taxpayer can either do it through a letter, or they can do it on the appeal form. They have to appeal that within 45 days. And the assessors, there's a provision in the code section, in this code section about boards of equalization that says the assessors have to review that appeal and respond to the taxpayers within 180 days. If the property under appeal in the county for that year exceeds 3% of the digest in number or value, the assessors can get an extension on another 180 days to respond to folks. And then there's a provision for the revenue commissioner to authorize an additional an additional 180 days, and then another unspecified amount of time if there's a good cause. So stuff happens in counties, and if everything goes right, the commissioner can extend those deadlines. But the downside to the county not complying with that provision is that generally if they don't respond to the taxpayer in a timely fashion, the appeal is over and the taxpayer's asserted value becomes the value, the final value.
What is the, how many jurisdictions did we have this past year that had an excess of 3%?
I have not counted that, but 3% would be tracked in their CAMA system, and we do ask for a certification from the assessor on whether or not they met that 3%. They don't have to give it to us, but it's wise to give it to us and let us put it in the appeal, in the digest folder, just so we know whether or not they did exceed at some point. In the CAMA system, the wind gap is going to tell them when they exceed 3% because it's designed to provide that notice for digest submission.
Are you able to see the CAMA systems for each jurisdiction in order to determine whether or not they've reported?
We can, the revenue agents that are assigned to do the technical support can review the CAMA system if the county opens that up. It's like, we can't just network into their CAMA system and start looking at their data. They have to open that up to us and invite us in, and then remotely we could, if they give us that authority. But we do ask for that certification in digest submission. We're not gonna reject a digest if they don't give it to us, but it helps them if they did meet the 3% rule, that there's a document in our digest submission folder that says they did, and then you know they get the automatic 180-day extension. Grant is not here today. He is our wind gap expert, and I just wanted to maybe share this with you. This is a PowerPoint on wind gap appeal module, and it helps the assessor follow every time frame and every point in the appeal process so that they don't miss their deadlines. And shall I pass it around or pass it forward? I didn't bring a bunch of copies, but it's useful information to know that it's very very comprehensive and allows the assessor to follow the process very well.
With what frequency is DOR actually asked to view the CAMA system of the jurisdictions?
Well, if we're doing a performance review, at the request of the commissioner, or the county will want to look at lots of years of data. If we're doing a digest review, a third-year digest review, we go into the county and look at documents, and we may look at their data at that point. And then if they ask us to, if they say, hey, help me with this problem that I'm having, let me see, we can dial in at that point.
And if you're doing your 3-year review, does DOR send a letter to the jurisdiction requesting permission to review the CAMA system?
We send quite a long spreadsheet and give them a litany list of questions to answer and documents to provide.
But at that time, you're not asking, and they're not authorizing you to review their CAMA system.
No.
Why not?
The reports that we would look at would most likely give us what we needed to know about the CAMA. I mean, the questionnaire that we provide goes through the Chapter 5, Title 48, and kind of hits the high points of, are you doing this? So we're interviewing that chief appraiser and looking at document evidence rather than CAMA data. But I mean, there wouldn't be a reason why we couldn't look at the CAMA data, but, we're looking at the reports that come out of the CAMA data.
Well, you can't, if I understood you correctly, you can't look at the CAMA data unless you've been invited to look at the CAMA data.
Right,
Okay, so what you're relying on is just the reports that they're generating to give to you, but not the actual CAMA data.
right.
Okay, so you wouldn't know whether or not there's a 3% appeal exceedance except by what they report to you.
That's
not-
correct.
Not by verification of the CAMA system by which they're utilizing.
Right, we would only know that they exceeded 3% if we were able to go into their CAMA data and look and see that they did, or they certified that to us in some document.
And the only check on that certification of the information in that document is whom? The tax commissioner, the board of assessors?
It's kind of self-check. Yes, no, there's no check on that. Unless there's a performance review, I suppose, and that jumped out that, hey, they didn't really have a lot of appeals, but they said they did. I mean, I suppose we could figure that out, but no, there's not a big effort to check that 3% rule.
Thank you. Go ahead, Pat. Representative
Thank
Carter.
you. I'm curious, in my discussion with the Fulton County tax appraiser, he talked about the value of the appeals for his purposes in getting the assessments more accurate. That the more people that appeal, the bigger opportunity he has to go in and take a better look at the property. Is that true in other counties, or?
Well, if someone files an appeal, you're gonna wanna go and visit that property and
Right.
see what the problem is. And then when you talk to taxpayers about their properties and you physically review them, you're gonna learn a lot that you need to know about the appraisals. That's why we recommend that they physically review each property every third year, because if you wait too long and you don't go and look at them, they change. So.
Yeah, a lot. You think it helps you, the accuracy of your appraisals?
Well, I do the collection part, so.
Oh, well, you
I
don't
just
know.
get the yeah,
What would your assessor say, do you think?
I can't speak.
You
to
can't
him.
speak.
I wouldn't begin to do that. but-
So you could get a lot of appeals, and it would be an indicator that, you know, you got real close to 40% assessment, and people are uncomfortable when you get right on that, you know, estimated number. But you could also do stuff really wrong and get a lot of appeals, and the taxpayers know that because they're uncomfortable with the number, so.
Ms. Mills, but there's not a statutory requirement that there's effectively a reevaluation done every 3 years. That's just a recommendation, right?
No, the code says this is the definition of fair market value, and the assessment level is 40%. So it looks like every year you need to be at that definition of fair market value at 40%. The 3-year review is really our relationship, the Revenue Department's relationship with the county, and how we review that level of assessment and how well the county does and whether or not they get penalized.
And then would it be fair to say, though, that if you have a high number of appeals, let's say within a neighborhood, going back to the terminology we learned last meeting, if you have a high number of appeals within that neighborhood, does that not then alter the valuation for that neighborhood as a whole?
So a high number of appeals would not.
That result in a change or an alteration to their overall assessment.
Okay, so the
let's just
assessor
assume-
filed, or the taxpayers filed appeal out of a neighborhood, lots of people appealed, and through the appeal process, many of those values were lowered.
Or it could be raised, but yeah, changed in any way.
I don't know that would necessarily cause those that didn't appeal to have to change, but there's nothing in the code that says those that didn't appeal should change. But I would think the assessor could learn more information. I mean, if you get collective wisdom and a whole lot of people in the same subdivision not happy with what you did, there's something potentially there that you did, the assessor may not have considered, so they could change for that.
Commissioner.
Thank you. I think what Ellen's trying to get to, and perhaps you, Mr. Chairman, as well, is that there's nothing that compels the Board of Assessors to modify properties in a neighborhood that didn't appeal. Only those that appealed would have their values modified, but that does not automatically then result in an adjustment to all the other properties that are similar in that neighborhood.
So in theory then, so in theory, what I'm kind of getting at here is that if you have a significant appeal within a neighborhood, numbers of appeals and adjustments accordingly as a result of those appeals, do the rest of the property owners in that neighborhood benefit as a result? So let's just say that you have an incident where a neighborhood has been assessed, the values have gone up fairly significantly. 10% or more of the individuals appeal that, and as a result, the assessors drop those values to some extent. As a result of that, those appeals and those individual property owners challenging the assessment for the neighborhood and their individual properties clearly, then does the rest of the neighborhood get the benefit of that adjustment? So if there's a 10% adjustment downward, then do the rest of the properties get that benefit, or do we start to get a disparity between those who appeal and those who choose not to appeal in the favor of those who appeal?
So in the current year, the year of the appeal, the year that is being appealed, the assessors would be barred from changing anyone's value on real property that didn't file an appeal, and that's
The subsequent year, though.
But in the subsequent year, there's nothing that would require them to do it, but if they lost 10% of the valuations in there, they should pay attention to what that issue was, and they could revalue the rest of them accordingly. I mean, it could be specific stuff to parcels, but we're talking about a market thing, I think, that you
Yes.
raised this too high and all of these appeals prevailed at Board of Equalization or wherever, so take a look at what you just did and think again. So they could do it in the following year, but not the current year.
Yeah, because if it's not adjusted global or universally within that neighborhood, just like if it wasn't adjusted and corrected over time for the entire county of the jurisdiction, then what I can see happen is that you start to get you have some that are behind in terms of assessed values, or some that are too far ahead in assessed values, and you get a lack of uniformity within that neighborhood categorization.
There's a provision at 48.5.299 paragraph C that is referred to often in the appeal code, and what it basically says is the finally determined value for the current year is set for 2 subsequent years, and the assessors or any appellant board is barred from changing that upwards. There's some exceptions to that, but basically that value becomes set for 2 years following the appeal, and I think that's what you're talking about, is that 299C provision.
That provision does bar that, but what I'm getting at is that if we're assessing value over the course of a neighborhood, to use the terminology from last meeting, then those that have appealed and challenged that and have come to find that as a group, those that have appealed were correct to some extent. The neighborhood, I'm wondering, does the neighborhood get the benefit in the subsequent year of the fact that now there's a discrepancy? So in other words, in order to keep the neighborhood uniform, it would seem to me that the assessor should then adjust the valuations based upon the previous year's appeals, and look at that to adjust the entire neighborhood accordingly. Whether that's up or down, that's not relevant. What I'm saying is just to make sure you're maintaining uniformity within that system. And so that's the question, and it sounds like there isn't anything that compels that,
Right.
but it should be considered.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Representative Gardner.
I just wanted to follow up on that. I mean, do we have any indication of what assessors do in terms of taking into account the appeals and then the next 2 or 3 years changing the neighborhoods, whatever that base value is?
I have no compiled data on
Yeah.
that.
We don't know. We have indicators.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so if any changes are, we're still talking Board of Equalization, we haven't made it past BOE yet. So if any changes are made in the valuation, the Board of Assessors has to send a notice of assessment, and that's gonna be a uniform notice that the Revenue Department provides. If the taxpayer accepts that, if they like that change, then the appeal ends without going further to the Board of Equalization. So the assessor has the option to once that appeal is filed to Board of Equalization, the assessor has that option to say, oh yeah, you're right, I'm gonna lower it, and here's your new assessment. If the taxpayer accepts that, then it's over, it ends. If no changes or corrections are made by the Board of Assessors, or if the taxpayer does not accept the change that the assessor gives them, then the taxpayer can appeal further. If no changes are made, it's kind of an automatic. The assessor's just gonna push that forward to the Board of Equalization without the taxpayer having to do any other documents or any other notifications. So at any time during the appeal process, the assessor and the taxpayer can mutually agree on a value, and that ends the appeal. So as they're going through, they have the ability to say, to come up to an agreement. And in that case, that 299C value applies. So 299C is, again, that provision that allows the taxpayer to get that same value for the following 2 years, with exceptions. The Board of Equalization hearing, once that appeal is certified to the appeal administrator, the Board of Equalization has 15 days to notify that taxpayer of a hearing that's going to occur between 20 and 30 days from the date of that notice. That's very specific timing. And the code section provides that the factual characteristics that are in the assessor's records are considered correct unless otherwise proven incorrect, and that the assessors have the burden of proving its opinions of value and the validity of its assessment through a preponderance of evidence. So the burden of proof is on the assessor on value. But remember, the taxpayer can appeal taxability to or denial of exemption to the Board of Equalization as well, and that burden is not on the assessor, it's on the party seeking the exemption. The Board of Equalization is going to hear that appeal. We have regulations on the appeal process to provide information to the Board of Equalization on how to operate their appeal hearings. And the Board of Equalization is required to announce its decision at the end of the hearing before it goes on to the next hearing, and to provide that written decision to each party. All 3 boards of equalization members have to be present. I think there's one county that can do it with 2, but there's a provision in the code that allows that. But in most counties, all 3 boards of equalization members have to be present, and of course a quorum votes on what the value should be, or the determination. It could be a taxability, denial of exemption, or uniformity issue, or all of the above. The code also in Board of Equalization says that any real property tax appeal may be lowered by the deciding body based upon the evidence presented, but cannot be increased from the amount assessed by the County Board of Assessors. And that provision doesn't apply when it's a 299C freeze. So if it's a value that was set from a prior year, then the deciding body, I suppose, could raise the value. In tax billing, the assessors have to provide the value appealed to the tax commissioner, because very often the tax commissioner is ready to bill and the appeals are not resolved. So the tax commissioner is going to send a temporary bill out to the taxpayer. It's usually going to be 85% of the amount appealed, but there are provisions for different amounts in the case of properties with improvements to them, but there's very specific exceptions to that. But overwhelmingly, tax commissioners bill appealed property at 85%. And so depending on the outcome of that appeal, that taxpayer may owe additional money or may get a refund. And so that's a summary of the Board of Equalization appeal. The next appeal method is to hearing officer. Hearing officers are certified general real property appraisers or certified residential real property appraisers, and they're certified by the Georgia Real Estate Appraisers Board. So these are expert appraisers. This type of appeal is only allowed for real property valued at greater than $500,000 and some contiguous property to that property. It has to be non-homestead property or wireless property, the aggregate, which is personal property, the aggregate value being over $500,000. And so on these more expensive, complex properties, complex appraisals, the taxpayer has the option to go to a hearing officer, which is a single person that listens to the evidence of both parties. The hearing officer does have to take training from the Revenue Department, but they're certified as qualified hearing officers by the Georgia Real Estate Appraisers Board. Revenue provides the training and then certifies to GREAB that this person has taken this amount of training, and then GREAB posts on their website the qualified hearing officers.
Ms. Mills, do you know about how many the state has that are qualified to serve as hearing officers presently?
Probably around 25 are qualified. And I don't know how many certified general real property appraisers are out there in the state, hundreds and hundreds, I'm sure, but only that amount have taken our training, which qualifies them. So 4,000.
But and out of that 4,000, 25 are certified by the department.
Yes. No,
Sure.
25 people.
Ellen, if you could, they approach the Department of Revenue indicating their willingness to serve as hearing officers, or how are they identified?
Yes, they ask us, when's your next training session? We have a training session a couple times a year, and there's just a handful of people in it, just not that many people interested, I'm sad to say, because I think the hearing officer appeals are a fabulous idea.
But so it's a voluntary service, it's not compulsory.
Right. So
Thank you.
just not that many interested in doing it.
Thank you, Commissioner. And who pays for the hearing officer's time and per diem?
The county, the hearing officer is going to pay for his own training, and I think we charge $150 for our 8-hour course, and so they have to pay for their own training, and they're already expert appraisers, so they've paid bukus of money to be where they are right there. But as far as the hearing time and the administrative facilities and all that, the county's going to budget that through the appeal administrator's office. There, I believe, is a provision that the parties can agree to pay the hearing officer more, but I don't know how often that might happen.
And then I think we'll follow up later to check the website to see how many hearing officer appeals were filed last year.
Okay, right.
Yeah,
The
or the year
2016 is
before that.
there, but we're getting 2017 up.
Okay. Thank you.
The once the appeal is forwarded to the hearing officer, the appeal administrator is going to randomly select from the list, or the parties can agree to a hearing officer. And if no hearing officer is appointed or no hearing is scheduled within 180 days after the Board of Assessors received the taxpayer's notice of appeal, the value asserted by the taxpayer becomes the final value. So that's a big encouragement to move forward with that appeal so that it doesn't drag out. If the appeal administrator cannot find a hearing officer that's willing to serve, they can convert that appeal to Board of Equalization. And the hearing officer has to take 8 hours from the Revenue Department initially to be qualified, and then 4 hours a year. And we have online training for that continuing ed requirement. And failure for the hearing officer to get that continuing ed requirement would render them ineligible to serve. I believe that GREAB gives them credit on their side as well, on their appraiser certification side as well for our training, which is nice. So the assessor has no more than 90 days to review this appeal to hearing officers. If the Board of Assessors fails to respond in writing to that taxpayer within the 180 days, the property value asserted by the taxpayer becomes the final value. If changes are made by the Board of Assessors, the taxpayer may notify the Board of Assessors within 30 days if they don't like the changes. So the assessor, again, has the option to make a change in the value that the taxpayer could potentially accept or reject. And then if the taxpayer rejects the change, or if the taxpayer or if the assessor does not make a change, then that moves on to the appeal administrator. The taxpayer can also change the venue if they don't want to go to Board of Equalization, but they filed that appeal initially. If they don't want to go to hearing officer, they can change to Board of Equalization. And if at any time during a Board of hearing officer appeal the two parties mutually agree, they can determine the value, and the provision of 299C applies. The hearing officer, in conjunction with the parties, is going to set the time and date and place for the parties to provide testimony, and each side can receive copies of the records the other is going to present, and there's specific rules on how that has to happen in timing. The hearing officer is going to swear in all the witnesses, perform the same basic duties that a Board of Equalization is going to do. It's just going to be this one expert appraiser listening to the evidence. And the hearing officers can hear appeals on value and uniformity, and anything else, like if there's a denial of exemption or a taxability issue, they can reserve that for a Superior Court decision later. And at the conclusion of the hearing, the hearing officer is to notify both parties verbally, and then also provide written decision. In the case of Board of Equalization and hearing officer and arbitration, which we'll talk about next, the taxpayer always has the option to go on to Superior Court. They have 30 days from that decision to move on to Superior Court if they're still not satisfied.
Ms. Mills, to what extent, and you may not know this, but to what extent is if you're challenging uniformity, to what extent does the public have access to that data of the neighborhood data that's being used to mass assess, mass appraise the property? So it seems to me, I don't know how you would present if you're just your individual taxpayers who's making the appeal. How would you even be able to raise an argument about uniformity unless the neighborhood information is available?
Uniformity is a tough concept to reject or to appeal on, but probably should always be appealed on. If you're going to do value, might as well do uniformity at the same time. The 485-306 says that has this records availability provision in it, and it says that the assessor is to provide all records that went into making this assessment, but it doesn't really define what that is, and we don't have a reg that defines what that is. So I think the answer to your question is it'd be pretty tough for the taxpayer, the average taxpayer, to know what to ask for.
So you kind of have to just fill out the form and check all the boxes, and then get the information after the fact,
right?
To decide whether or not you made the right selection.
And the information you get might lead to more questions, and because when we were reviewing WinGap the other day, you could see how comprehensive it is, and there's a lot of data in there that the assessor could provide, but providing all of the data that they use to a taxpayer would be pretty tough to do. So maybe defining what data should be provided to be most helpful might be a reg or something that could be helpful, but
But if I have this straight, the kind of the sequence of events are that the DOR has a form that the taxpayer can use to file a notice of appeal,
right,
or they can do it in another format. But as long as they've essentially made a notice of appeal and filed that with the assessor's office, then there are certain things that they can appeal and certain things that they cannot, that you need to make those selections.
right,
You make those selections, and then it's after you made those selections that then it opens the door for the Board of Assessors to re-review the value, or the parties to mutually discuss a agreed upon value. And then after that, then it would go to the BOE or hearing officer, depending on which route you're moving in, which is driven by the value of the property, assessed
Right.
value of the property. But in those, whether you're in either one of those two formats, at that time, then you're requesting documents and interviews pertaining to what you've appealed. Is that a fair assessment?
right,
of
yes,
So you really have to kind of just check all the boxes and then go get the information after the fact as you move through the appeal process. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that would be what most people would do. I mean, they would have an idea that I don't really agree with this value, I'm gonna appeal it, because they only have this window to appeal, so they're gonna go ahead and get that in, and then they're gonna start doing some research and figure out if they like it or not.
Okay. I'm wondering if there's not a way to make it a little bit more transparent on the front end, so that the taxpayer has a better sense of whether it's even worth the bother. Because it sounds like, once you trigger this, you start triggering a whole bunch of other administrative responsibilities, and that of course incurs cost to the assessor's office, to the county for doing that. Whether it's the appeal administrator weighing in, selecting a hearing officer, not selecting a hearing officer, the reassessment process. So there's just that in my mind, I wonder if there's not a way to provide more information in advance that may reduce the number of appeals filed.
So,
have cost on the other end of it too,
Yeah.
with a taxpayer or whatever having to hire an attorney to,
Heaven forbid,
that,
heaven
yeah.
forbid.
but they do, and it's very expensive.
No, it is, and just briefly on that point, it's, those taxpayers that are listening, it's informative to think about pragmatically, whether an appeal is worth the expenditure. So, I mean, you can be very upset about the assessed value, but when you apply the 40% rule of how that is, and you actually work the numbers out, you come to find out that a 10 to 20% change in your taxes may only result in a residential property may only result in several hundreds of dollars change in your taxes paid, and oftentimes taxpayers get very upset about the assessed value and think it's overassessed, but the cost of trying to pursue that appeal in terms of what is your return on that investment may only be several hundreds of dollars. And so to Commissioner Powers' point, you can actually get yourself into a little bit of a hole by going to hiring an attorney to do this. And when are you going to hire an attorney? You're going to hire them pretty much on the front end to check all those boxes, to trigger all these responses. By that time, you may be already in the hole several hundreds of dollars with the attorney, only to come out with a change that, while it's good for 3 years and locked in for 3 years, the current year plus the 2 subsequent years, the net outcome may only be $1,000 or $2,000, but you may have spent that just trying to approach it. And in that sense, it becomes, one, you have to be a fairly sophisticated and educated about this process and understanding it. You have to have some sense of knowledge about what your return on investment is. And then you have to also not let your emotions get away from you. But just that hurdle alone probably forestalls a lot of people from filing. And then while that may only matter for 1 year, when you start stacking up the years as they build cumulatively over the course of it, then that number actually can get real, be a significant value. And not just a couple $100s, but it could be thousands of dollars that you've overpaid, arguably. So I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
So, like,
anyway.
what I'm thinking of when you're saying that is like the difference between single property appraisal and, mass appraisal. In single property appraisal, you're gonna get this detailed report. Reporting is huge, and that appraiser has to tell you what they thought about and what they looked at, and even in the summary, form report, you're gonna get a lot of information about the calculations and what they did. Where in mass appraisal, you're gonna get a notice of assessment that just kinda tells you this is what it is. And you're not gonna get the whys and what we thought about and where you are in the neighborhood and, or any of that. So, possibly a narrative that could go with that assessment notice, maybe posted online about the process, could be helpful. So.
Well, but thinking kind of a little, trying to provide some information to the property owners, but not overburden the assessor's office, is that as the neighborhood is defined, it allows the property owner to say, okay, the average person to look at their property and say, I've been placed in this neighborhood. I have a map. If it's important to me, I can literally drive around and do effectively a mass appraisal using just common sense and say, they've put me in this neighborhood, put my property in this neighborhood and with this group of other properties. You could, if you knew the map and you knew what the general characteristics of that neighborhood were, you could then do your own self-assessment and say, okay, am I really a part of this neighborhood? Am I like this neighborhood or not? In terms of all the building construction elements that are used to form the base of this wind gap system. So if that's known, then I think that's more information than currently exists that I'm aware of to the general public, so that they can say, okay, well, now I see why they've clustered me here and why I've been placed with this grouping. And yes, okay, I agree, I probably fall in that grouping, or no, I don't, and this is why I don't, and therefore I think I need to make that appeal. I need to make that assertion to have them reevaluate my property in particular. But I don't know that information, that general neighborhood information is available, and that mapping of that information is available to the public in general for across the state.
Right.
Go ahead, Representative.
Has there ever been a challenge on uniformity of neighborhood determination? I mean, have anybody ever challenged the assessors that this neighborhood is unfairly determined based on another neighborhood?
Oh, I'm sure there has been. That would be, a huge thing, is what group of properties are you comparing my property to? And I'm sure there has. I don't have any statistics on that, but that would be something that a taxpayer would want to know.
Thank you.
The next appeal method is the non-binding arbitration, and there's a provision in 485306 regarding the appeal methods that I think still refers to binding arbitration, so it might need to be fixed at 306.
Say that again.
It does, when the code changed from binding arbitration to non-binding arbitration, 306 wasn't fixed regarding the binding. It's no longer binding, it's non-binding. So in 311, there is this non-binding arbitration, and it first of all defines what a certified appraisal is, because it's going to spin off of the taxpayer providing a certified appraisal. And that means an appraisal given, signed, and certified by a real property appraiser classified by the Georgia Real Estate Commission. So the taxpayer's gonna go out in this particular venue and have an appraisal done or use an appraisal they've already had. And they're going to appeal to an arbitrator by filing with the Board of Assessors. And the Board of Assessors, within 10 days of receiving that appeal from the taxpayer, is gonna send the taxpayer an acknowledgement that we did receive your appeal and a notice that you have to provide this certified appraisal within 45 days. Failure of the taxpayer to provide that certified appraisal within 45 days ends the appeal. And so it's important that taxpayer get the proper notice. The Board of Assessors has 45 days to review that appraisal once given by the taxpayer, and they can accept the appraisal and the appeal ends and that appraisal value becomes the final value, or they can reject it by sending within 10 days a notice to the taxpayer stating that they're going to reject that appraisal. In the event that the County Board of Assessors neither accepts or rejects or responds to the taxpayer within the proper amount of time, the appeal ends and the taxpayer's asserted value becomes the fair market value of the property. The assessor is going to certify that appeal to the arbitrator or the appeal administrator, and the appeal administrator is going to determine or look for an arbitrator. I believe there's a provision in the code that they can agree on a single arbitrator, that the parties can agree on a single arbitrator. Otherwise, a chief judge can appoint the arbitrator. And at any point in the arbitration appeal, the two parties agree to a value, they can end the appeal, and that can become the final value. The arbitrator has to be a certified general real property appraiser, certified by the Georgia Real Estate Commission, and he has to have expertise in that subject area, that subject property area. The arbitrator, within 30 days after appointment, has to set the time and place for the parties to give their testimony. And the appeal administrator is going to provide administrative assistance and a place to do that. The notice is going to advise each party they can request a list of witnesses, documents, and other evidence to be presented. The taxpayer has a one-time option to change that date and time to a convenient time for all parties. The presiding or chief judge of Superior Court can move the process along and request the hearing officer to set the hearing date if that's taking too long. The arbitrator is going to maintain a record of all the documents and testimony in the appeal process, and the appeal administrator is going to help them out with that. In order to determine fair market value, the arbitrator may consider the final value for the property submitted by the County Board of Assessors and the final value submitted by the taxpayer. The taxpayer is responsible for their own appraisal costs, so they're going to have to, remember, give that appraisal up front, and they're responsible for that cost. So that would be the primary cost to the taxpayer. However, once the arbitrator chooses a value, and it doesn't have to be either or, they get to determine what the value is. Whoever's value is closest to what the arbitrator determined, the other party gets to pay for the arbitrator. So it's a little interesting there. And at the conclusion of the hearing, the arbitrator shall render a decision and notify the parties verbally and in writing. And again, the temporary tax bill is adjusted accordingly, depending on the outcome. And the assessor has 10 days after the final determination to provide that to the tax commissioner.
Commissioner Rowland.
Thank you. Ellen, because it's non-binding arbitration, if the property owner doesn't agree with the final value, what recourse do they have at that point?
They have 30 days from the date of that written decision to appeal to Superior Court.
So Superior
So
Court
all
is their next venue.
All three venues can go up to Superior Court. It
Thank
used
you.
to be that it was binding and they couldn't go further.
Thank you.
Why did, do you know why the change was made? And I'm sure there's some members in the audience that participated in those revisions
I
years
don't
ago,
know the
but,
answer.
and then, so this process, it sounds similar to the hearing officer process, except that you're just, the taxpayer has the burden of submitting an appraisal
Right.
to effectively trigger it. And it sounds like to me you're submitting the appraisal to the Board of Assessors effectively to say, we think this is the appraised value. We have a certified appraisal by a Georgia real estate appraiser, and this is what we think you should value the property at. Effectively, the Board of Assessors can say, and we're calling for an arbitration, non-binding arbitration, to review that. At that point, then it becomes the dueling assessments, and an arbitrator, a person in the middle that gets to pick between the two of them. And the way the penalty works is it's effectively a baseball arbitration. The loser winds up paying the cost. Am I misunderstanding that as far as the summary?
Right, and the other thing to note about that is usually the arbitrators, very often, the arbitrators are the same people that are hearing officers because they've got that same GREAB certification and they've gotten some DOR training on how the tax appeal thing goes, and so very often it's that same 25.
Okay, and yeah, it's curious to me that we have this process. I suspect this doesn't get used very much because of the upfront. Was that?
That was gonna be my point.
Yeah.
Probably use the least of all of them.
Board of Equalization would be the most used, and this one, the difference is it doesn't have that value limit. So whereas the hearing officer, you have to have $500,000 in value, the arbitration does not have that limit. So you might have a unique property that you just don't feel like the assessors are getting it right, and it's not valued at $500,000, so you can't get to hearing officer.
It's an interesting process because because the property owner under this scenario would put up their own appraised value and appraisal for the property. So it seems effectively, you know, when you say it's non-binding, effectively it leaves it in the property owner's discretion as to whether or not they want a second bite at the apple, so to speak. So that obviously if the property owner is okay with the outcome of that binding arbitration, they're not going to appeal it. If they are, they could appeal it. But it's interesting though that both parties have that right to appeal, because the tax assessor also has the right to appeal to Superior Court if he or she feels that the arbitrator came up with a number that was too low.
Right.
So there's that avenue for both parties to go to, and that's interesting to me as to why we shifted it from binding to non-binding. Other questions, comments?
And then within 30 days after the decision of arbitration, hearing officer, or Board of Equalization, the taxpayer can file to Superior Court. And there is a provision in the code that, you know, the County Board of Assessors shall not appeal a decision of the Board of Equalization arbitrator or hearing officer changing an assessment by 20% or less unless the Board of Assessors gives the governing authority notice of its intention to appeal. So if they have just a small change in their own assessment, they're limited a little bit. You have to give the governing authority the heads up that you want to appeal that, because the governing authority is going to have to foot the bill for litigation. So, but the assessor can appeal as well to Superior Court if they're not happy. An appeal by the taxpayer shall specifically state the grounds for their appeal, and again, have to notify the assessors within 30 days of that final decision. Within 45 days of the receipt of the taxpayer's notice of appeal, and before that assessor certifies that to Superior Court, the Board of Assessors shall send to the taxpayer a notice of settlement conference. And so this is a provision that provides for another type of settlement or meeting of the minds before they actually go directly into court. There's specific timing on when the taxpayer has to be notified and when that settlement conference needs to happen, and the taxpayer has a one-time option to make a change to that to a time acceptable to both parties. After the settlement conference has convened, the parties can even continue the settlement conference if they don't agree. If at the end of the review period, the Board of Assessors elects not to hold a settlement conference, then the appeal terminates and the taxpayer's value becomes the fair market value. So it's very important that the assessor provide this settlement conference to the taxpayer. Otherwise, the appeal ends, taxpayer's value asserted in the appeal becomes the value, and the 299C applies to that.
Ellen, do they get awarded attorney fees at that point?
If the taxpayer
Is it-
chooses not to,
Because I know when that 20%, and I think that went into effect just a few years ago. With
well,
the
if the
revisions.
taxpayer chooses not to participate in the settlement conference, they can't get, the code says they can't get attorney fees, but I don't know if
See-
maybe part of their conference, settlement conference would be, hey, you pay this, you pay your stuff, and maybe it's part of their agreement in their settlement conference about the attorney fees, but it doesn't really say anything at that point. If at the conclusion of the settlement conference, the parties reach an agreement, that value becomes the final value. If they can't reach an agreement, then the assessor's gonna send a notice to the taxpayer telling them you have to pay the filing fee, which is $25 to Superior Court, and then the assessor will certify that in to Superior Court. And again, the appeal administrator is handling all the documentation and making sure that the appeal file is complete. And all the papers become part of that certification to the clerk of Superior Court. And we don't have regulations on appeal hearings. That's Superior Court world, and that's kind of where we end. But the outcome of the Superior Court appeal could also be appealed further up in some situations, and the assessor's going to wait for that appeal to be final 30 days after that appeal decision before they forward the final value to the tax commissioner. We have regulations on boards of equalization and hearing officer appeals on how those are run. We do not have regulations on arbitration or Superior Court because it's more Superior Court rules.
Ms. Mills, does that conclude your
It
presentation?
does,
Okay.
yes.
Well, let me open up for questions from members of the committee. If there are any follow-up questions from Ms. Mills. Seeing none, I wanted to say thank you very much.
Thank you.
You have prepared an extensive PowerPoint presentation on the assessment process, and then in addition to that, you've also prepared this very thorough summary for us to review. I would ask, Brian, that we send that out to make sure that all the members have it. If you don't have it here today, I think you should have it today, but if you don't, we'll get that sent out. With that being said, what I'd like to do at this point is just take a 10-minute recess, and then we'll come back in and hear from those that have signed up. And the first on our list will be Miss Alla Rakin. So we'll take a 10-minute recess and come back here at 11:27, and then we'll finish up our hearing today, hopefully before noon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Our list, we have Ms. Rakin from Evershed Sutherland LLP. If you, I'm sorry, let's get a. If you'll just pull that. Yeah, if you can sit any one of those. If it would be better if you could pull at the head of the table and grab that mic and slide down there to it. Then that way we can get that, put you on the witness mic. And is that the witness mic, Brian, or is it a different one? It's two? Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you. All right, very good. Ms. Rakin is handing out a handout for all of us to review here. So, and we are very happy to have you here. We're happy to have all of the people that wish to speak to the from the public to the committee. And with that, I'll let you go ahead and start. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Welch, and thank you, members of the committee, for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Alla Rakin, and I'm an attorney in the state and local tax practice at Evershed Sutherland, a law firm here in Atlanta. We represent corporate taxpayers and property tax appeals throughout the state, and I am very grateful for the opportunity to give you some input based on our observations in litigating a lot of these cases. My comments today focus on the litigation aspects for the commercial taxpayers. So the handout that I put before you has some suggestions, but if you think it's more appropriate based on your comments to talk about some of the suggestions for improvements next time, I'm happy to come back and speak. But
No, go ahead with your comments and suggestions. We'll
Okay.
take them now.
Great. Okay. So as you know, in 2016, amendments to the appeals process became effective and enacted through HB 202, and they made a lot of improvements to the law, but the law does not fully achieve the intended goals of protecting taxpayers' rights and increasing out-of-court settlements. A lot of these tax appeals still have to go through litigation. Local property tax appeals process is often inefficient and problematic for large Georgia taxpayers. Now, the 2016 changes did provide new administrative remedies, as Ellen laid out, like the hearing officer option. But these options, one, don't cover all types of business property, and the law for appealing to Superior Court was not updated accordingly with these options. Specifically, the changes made it more common that a taxpayer does prevail at the administrative level, but the law doesn't directly address County Board of Assessors choosing to appeal in those situations, as you, Chairman Welch, noted. There are insufficient safeguards against a county indiscriminately appealing reasoned rulings in favor of the taxpayer. And there's little motivation to expedite the resolution of these appeals. Specifically, unlike other non-property tax litigation, attorney's fees are generally unavailable except in limited situations, and the interest that accrues on refunds that are due to the taxpayer is capped. In conjunction with the goal of minimizing unnecessary litigation, there are shortcomings in the administrative process. For many complex appraisal issues, there's little recourse for aggrieved taxpayers short of going to court. For personal property, such as manufacturing machinery or high-tech equipment, a taxpayer may face identical issues in multiple Georgia counties repeatedly every year. Going through the document, some of the problems and prospective changes I've outlined below include allowing alternatives to Board of Equalization for complex cases at the administrative level. Specifically, make hearing officers available for any taxpayer with a large property. So the current law, as Ellen had explained, has the $500,000 threshold for only real property, and hearing officers are real estate approved hearing officers. These hearing officers would make sense just as well in the personal property context for complex business cases where there are other ways that these hearing officers could be certified, like the American Society of Appraisers for personal property. Next, it would be helpful to restrict court appeals by the County Board of County Board of Assessors in certain situations. First, counties should not be able to appeal the finding of a hearing officer on valuation issues. Now, the option of hearing officers, as Ellen explained, hearing officers are accredited, they're trained, and when they have the hearing, they consider the valuation evidence that's presented to them. So they make an independent finding of the value of the property. And this option was created to avoid court, and there's currently just no disincentive for when a county loses at the hearing office level to go ahead and appeal. It also creates no particularly strong incentive for them to present a strong case to the hearing officer, because they just can go again at the Superior Court. Alternatively, there could be higher thresholds for approving litigation going forward to the Superior Court. Now, Ellen mentioned the provision in the law which requires that the Board of Assessors notify their governing authority of an appeal that's less than 20% of the value. First, this could be an affirmative requirement rather than allowing the governing board to, come in and deny it. So that to make sure that the governing board is actively reviewing the decision. Threshold should be higher. Sometimes this just doesn't have a huge effect. Particularly, there's nuances to situations where the appeal is not one on valuation. So something like an exemption would likely be more than 20% of the value. So this is important for accountability and making sure that the county understands the risks of litigation. But there should also be more disincentives to actually going to Superior Court for the county. Two major issues are attorney's fees and interest. Now, you had already discussed attorney's fees a little bit, but we believe they should be recoverable in all cases to avoid unnecessary litigation. Right now, a taxpayer who wins at the administrative level cannot recover the attorney's fees if the county goes forward and appeals to Superior Court. And then the current law is written to say that the final determination of if the final determination of value ends up being 85% of the valuation set at the administrative level, the taxpayer shall recover attorney's fees, and that's only if the taxpayer is the one appealing, and also only if the issue in Superior Court is a valuation issue. So there was a 2009 Court of Appeals case which determined that when taxability is the issue, the taxpayer is not entitled to attorney's fees. Having this bar on attorney's fees in so many situations removes the typical hazard of litigation when the county is making the decision of whether to appeal. There's much less incentive to avoid litigating weak or especially risky positions, while the intended purpose of the appeals process is to avoid these more litigation. And often this will leave only the taxpayer with the big dilemma of whether to pay an illegal excessive tax instead of incurring the litigation costs, because there is no possibility of recovering the attorney's fees.
What if, Ms. Rakin, what if the property tax owner decided to file for recoupment of taxes paid under the recoupment statute that I do believe allows for attorney's fees to be collected?
It would have to, I think it would have to be something that would have to be litigated, and I imagine any county would challenge that. So I think it's definitely something that we would consider in a case, but it would still, require additional attorneys' costs and litigation costs to get a court to determine that.
So you're saying to try to avoid the litigation, placing a burden in the process would help avoid the subsequent litigation. In this context, though, where Clayton County Board of Tax Assessors, that decision, and then the way the statute's written, you're only going to get there if you make the appeal. So the current structure is you still have to litigate to get there anyway.
Right.
Right. So you have a suggestion on doing something alternatively, where there's attorney's fees that are that can be accrued and accumulate during the process, the administrative process?
I think it wouldn't necessarily have to be during the administrative process. I think just the threat of attorney's fees, if the county board of assessors chooses to go to superior court, because right now that's just not that doesn't need to be a consideration when you're making the choice of whether to appeal like a hearing officer decision.
Okay. Thank you.
Next, the interest provisions are also a little different from the typical situation, and we believe interest should accrue during the course of an appeal in order to also provide an incentive to quickly resolve a matter. The current cap on interest is $5,000 for non-homestead property. As you know, the interest rate is it changed recently. I think it's about 8% right now. So, with a large piece of property and ongoing litigation, you get to that $5,000 cap very quickly, and drawing on the appeal for even longer, there is no threat of additional interest for a county, so there is no reason to resolve the appeal faster. So taxpayers should be paid full interest on any refund that is due as determined by a court without a cap.
Wouldn't that need to go both ways, though?
Yes. Usually, though, in this situation, because the taxpayer is, they pay the 85%, and if the taxpayer is the one appealing, there isn't additional interest due from them. Does that make sense? Like, it doesn't come up as often from this scenario.
Right, but if it did, and you actually went and litigated the case, and it came out that a jury decided that, in fact, the value was undervalued significantly, whether it's personal property, and in this context is just dealing with the value of real property, but then it would also need to be the same, so that a taxpayer who is a frequent litigant when it comes to tax appeals, and also it had the same risk, because while we are concerned about the taxpayer, we also have to be concerned about the rest of the taxpayers who are having to shoulder the burden of a cost of litigation, and they're, albeit it's divided amongst the vast population of taxpayers in the group, it's minimal, but it's still there, and having folks that are pattern litigants on these tax appeals shifts that cost burden over to them. So I think we have to work both ways in order for it to be fair.
Right, and there isn't, the same cap doesn't apply the other way. I can't remember exactly what the provision on the taxpayer side is, but it isn't the same cap. An additional suggestion once a notice of appeal is filed, as Ellen explained, the settlement conference is now required, and these settlement conferences can be made to be much more effective. Right now, they're largely perfunctory and requirements that the county holds them in these cases. legislature could consider options on how to make these conferences more meaningful, either by defining the term good faith that's used in the statute, or maybe a specific procedure that's required. Often there might be a settlement conference that's done to make sure that the boxes are checked and the requirements are fulfilled, but there isn't a real prospect of settling at that conference, and the case just proceeds to court. Also, the statute should be made clear that settlement conferences are required regardless of whether the county or the taxpayer appeals. Presently, county boards of assessors take the position that it is only required when the taxpayer appeals because of how the wording in the statute could be interpreted. We think that the goal of the settlement conference is to avoid litigation, and it should apply in both situations. And lastly, one suggestion to consider is allowing for tax tribunal jurisdiction in certain property tax appeals. As I mentioned, it's often very difficult for large taxpayers who are in multiple counties to pursue appeals, and there's fears of the difficulty of litigating in local jurisdictions. Many states allow at least some options for local administrative level appeals to a statewide body, such as the tax tribunal, for defined complex cases. And Judge O'Neill isn't here today, but the tribunal might have capacity for caseload and is doing an excellent job with the state tax appeals. It also already has jurisdiction over centrally assessed property. And it could also be an avenue for more oversight over the Board of Assessors, because it would streamline the process and help establish rules. And I know this committee has expressed some ways to afford accountability, so this could be one avenue to pursue.
With respect to the appeals that are brought or in the administrative process, in your experience, what are you seeing in terms of the burden of proof that is now currently placed on assessors' offices to establish value? How is that playing out at the BOE or the hearing officer level?
Typically the BOA presents their opinion of value based on the notice. There isn't a lot of other evidence presented at the administrative level.
Okay. All right, questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, thank you. Ms. Rakin.
Thank you very much.
We have James Roberts and Chris Boyer from GAPTP. Do y'all want to come up and speak together?
Yes, sir, please.
Please introduce yourselves to the members of the committee.
Yes, sir. My name is James Roberts. I'm a partner with the property tax consulting firm of Fellers, Shuey, Scott & Roberts. I'm also on the executive board of the Georgia Association of Property Tax Professionals, which is an organization, if I may, real quickly. We were founded in 2008, and it's a group of like-minded professionals that are in the property tax management business, and we came together to help and assist in various arenas with property taxes around the state. Believe it or not, I've been doing this for 35 years. I know that's hard to believe, but for the first 25 years, things were basically smooth sailing, the way the system worked. Some curious things like collection of property taxes were, why was it in the fall? And that's when the crops came in. So, we kind of understood the process. Well, in 2008, that started changing. And over the last 10 years, there have been a tremendous amount of changes in the property tax business here in Georgia in the terms of the appeals, the collection of taxes, and that kind of thing. And that was basically created and caused in two different arenas. Number one, it was legislative personalities sometimes. There were some people in the legislature that had, when the power shift came from Republicans to Democrats, it was basically a change in a philosophy and some new ideas. And secondly, most importantly, it was a Great Recession. So a lot of things that you see in our appeals process right now were the direct results of legislation that started back in that time frame, and it has kind of morphed along. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris here in just a moment. But what our organization would like to present to the committee and the people here is the opportunity to ask, or we want to be a resource. We've been a resource in the past to legislators. Senator Rogers was the architect of 346. We were very instrumental, along with other folks, in a lot of the provisions that you see right now. We have experience in states that are surrounding us, and Chris will tell you, in states that are across the country. Every state has a property tax system. Some are better, some are worse. The three-legged approach we have here in Georgia, income, sales, and property tax, quite frankly, works very, very well. I live in this state. It works very well, and it insulates us against huge, dramatic economic changes so that our state doesn't go broke, i.e. California. So I feel, and I'll let Chris speak on that quite frankly, our system, in comparison, is pretty good. Now, that doesn't mean there are not things that we cannot improve on. We see those things every day in representing our clients. But systematically, we have a pretty good, I think when Ellen went through that process, you kind of got the sense of, well, you know what, there are a lot of things there, yes, but most of them, by and large, help the taxpayer. Now, again, definitely think there are things that can be improved on, and we can offer those suggestions, in our opinion, on things that can make a real difference here. But overall, speaking, is a pretty solid system overall. But again, that is kind of my perspective on it, and then I want to just turn it over to my associate here, just let him introduce himself as well.
Thank you. My name is Chris Boyer. I'm with Ryan. Ryan is a private tax consulting firm. I have worked as a tax consultant for a couple of different firms for the past 17 years. Prior to that, I was a commercial fee appraiser. As James pointed out, he and I work in a similar industry servicing companies that by and large own, majority of what they own is commercial real estate. Some of them are owner-operators, some of them are investors, some of them are locally based, some of them are regionally based, some of them are nationally based. So as a group, our companies tend to have access to different methodologies. James pointed out that there are some states that work better than others. And as you may or may not know, there's some wide disparities about the process from state to state, even our neighboring states. So as James pointed out, as you go through this process, there are questions that may come up, and it seems to me that we have heard perhaps there's some interest in getting an understanding of what some of the neighboring counties, some of the neighboring states, how they work through their process, what may or may not work in those situations. There are other states around the country that can be examples of things that do or don't work. So James has said, I think, by and large, Georgia tends to operate a pretty smooth system. There are some areas that probably can be polished, but that's the case anywhere. We're not really here to advocate anything specific, more as to offer ourselves as a resource so that if there's some information you might not be aware of, that we do what we can to provide it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Members of the committee, any questions? Yes, John, go ahead. Four.
Guys, thank you for being here. Or do you typically get involved in residential or commercial property?
Well, I'll answer it first. Our clientele is primarily commercial, but I'm a taxpayer in the state of Georgia, so, you know, I get my notice, and I have my neighbors, and I have my neighborhood, and so I talk to my neighbors. And I also, there are companies in this industry that do primarily focus on a residential base. So we do have a pretty good understanding, you know, we definitely have a good understanding of the system by and large, but our primary focus is commercial.
And as a follow-up, Mr. Chairman, are you going to be providing written recommendations for us, or have you done that already?
We've not to date. We honestly, we wanted to make ourselves available and understand areas that might be more sensitive, and provide that kind of feedback. We can certainly give you some suggestions if that's most helpful.
What we were also trying to do is, in the committee meetings to this point, is understand what you felt like your problem was, or the most important problem you had that you needed to try to solve. Because, universally it's very difficult, but if you pare it down to what you think is the most important, if it is frequency of reappraisals, for instance, because I remember hearing the chairman make a mention, 6 years is too long. I also heard today that 3 years is just a review suggestion. In theory, it's a review, but it's not really. So there are states that have mandated reappraisal cycles. That may be every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years, and generally they're catered towards the market, i.e. Atlanta, Charlotte. Very difficult to wait 6 years to change values, or you're going to have a huge problem. The sticker shock in and of itself is going to be a huge problem. You need to do that more frequently, but you also need to make that not a suggestion, or perhaps it needs to really be something that's more concrete with some consequences not doing so, if that's your problem.
And I think that's a valid point. We've attended several of these meetings, and one of the common themes seems to be some perhaps lack of consistency in the reassessment cycle. Some counties do a great job at maintaining that and being uniform and efficient. There are other counties, as we know, that have not done as good a job at maintaining consistency, and so it seems to me that might be an area that could be addressed.
Right, in terms of maybe having the DOR have a little better ability to have oversight, maybe legislatively, to have a little bit, because some states have a more involved and a stronger oversight by their Department of Revenue, by their tax commission, whatever they want to call it. And so that ability will create a little more compliance. Now, the problem we have in Georgia, and again, I live here, it's 159 counties. There's 159, it's very political too. So you get that. So that process has to be somehow dealt with as well. Now, one last thing I would say is we had talked about Maryland. Maryland is a great state that you might want to think about, reviewing, because Maryland has a statute that allows a 3-year reappraisal. Every parcel in every county is divided, and you have to reappraise it once every 3 years. So there's constant reviews going on. Once every 3 years, the county's divided into thirds. How do you, they even have statutes where you phase in increases. Now, again, this is comprehensive. It is more of a situation by which you use technology, not appraisal part. But it's really math. If the value goes from 100 to 400, it goes up $100 each year, gets reappraised the next year. That way the taxpayer doesn't feel the immediate impact to that. Because again, what you will find is the same as I find. The biggest problem that the taxpayers have many times is the notice comes out from April to July. Their taxes are due in September and October. That is a hard thing to deal with. There are things that we can do, though, to help with that process in terms of when those, and then that goes back to what I initially said. Georgia, being an agrarian economy, made the taxes due when the crops came in. That's when people had their money. But that doesn't have to be that way.
All right, so let's, John, any other questions?
No, I'm fine.
I think what would be helpful is if you have areas that you think are important. You said you've repeatedly said that there are some things that could be changed or adjusted, made better. If you would submit those to the committee, that would be helpful. And then I have some follow-up questions, but I know that Representative Gardner has some questions.
Well, I wanted to follow up. I would be interested in your suggestions to us. It's great to have a good system. Every system probably needs some
Absolutely.
tweaking, and you would know that better than we do. So I would appreciate your suggestions. The other question I had, in your experience working with other states, I mean, is it possible to differentiate areas that seem to have a lot of change from other areas? I mean, is there a way to do that?
You mean internally, like within a jurisdiction of the state of Georgia where you have a,
Different sort of requirement that maybe you do reappraisals every year, or I don't know what the answer would be, but.
That might be a bit challenging, in that trying to isolate pockets that were worthy of change.
Yeah.
An example might be North Carolina is a state that has a pretty unique system. They reassess property anywhere from 4 to 8 years with a static data value in effect, meaning if they reassess for 18, the data value is January 1st of 18. And so it may be another 8 years before they reassess property. So obviously we don't have that system, fortunately. Fortunately, yes. But the challenge there, and originally the thought process behind that was probably to that effect, where you're in smaller markets, smaller rural communities that might not have a lot of market activity. There might not be support for change. You might not have access to the data. There are just not as many people, so there's not as much market activity. The larger jurisdictions, the larger counties and states tend to have a more frequent reassessment. In North Carolina, the cities and the counties, Charlotte, Raleigh-Durham, Greensboro, those tend to be on 4-year cycles, and they're moving to even shorter cycles because they've realized.
And that's by law.
Yes, ma'am.
And what's the criteria for having different standards?
In terms of standards, you mean
I mean,
revaluation
define
cycles?
Charlotte or Greens, yeah.
You want me to?
Go ahead.
Yeah, because I've been doing it. Yeah, that's that 35 years coming back to me. North Carolina, again, everything is based on your state constitution too, and because we are basically governed that way. North Carolina has something called the Machinery Act, which basically mandates their property tax, basically their property tax system. It's a little different from our constitution, but what they did, they divided up their counties into quadrants, all their counties, and they said, okay, here are our counties, and based on population, you can do it every 4 or 8 years. Well, some counties chose 8, and it makes perfect sense because if you think about it related to our state, Early County, Georgia, Blakely, I know people down there. That market probably changes very little over 4 years. Fulton County, DeKalb, Gwinnett changes every 4 days sometimes. So, it's hard to apply the same standards, and so North Carolina chose not to do that, and they allowed within that parameter, within their Machinery Act, they allowed those counties to choose. Well, now Charlotte, Raleigh, the areas that have significant growth, much faster growth, are now going to, they're now going to stipulate and allow them a 2-year cycle, which makes more sense. Again, during the downturn, that 8-year cycle helped out because values were dropping. So counties didn't have to reduce values, and that's what happened. They didn't reduce values because they didn't have to. They don't raise them, but they also don't reduce them. So that allows the local governments to maintain. That's why you never saw Raleigh, Charlotte go bankrupt. I mean, because their stable source of revenue is much more stable. But
what have you seen any jurisdictions that have used a market-based system to allow for a general increase or decrease in when I say market-based system, I mean a more or less automated system that allows for the taxes, the assessed values to increase relative to that market transaction as opposed to just doing the mass assessment and allowing for that adjustment to occur over time consistent with the marketplace, so that if you're seeing market trends going up 1 year, in property values at 3 or 4, 5%, and then you're seeing it going down in subsequent years, that the following year is adjusted accordingly, so that if you have a community that's a neighborhood classified neighborhood by the local assessor's office, and that neighborhood is seeing a reduction in values, could be precipitous, but reflected in those market changes, is there any, have you seen any jurisdictions that have that more or less automated and tied to market-based conditions?
Short answer, no. As I think through that, California, you may have heard California's property tax system is challenged. Prop 13 is the process by which your value is limited to no more a 2% increase in value year over year until you sell it. And then when you sell it, it goes to market, which is in effect your purchase price. So what ends up happening is the neighbor who keeps their house for 20 years has their value capped at 2% through the hold. And then the guy next door who sells his house, after having it 20 years, it gets bounced up to here. So you have two houses side by side that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in disparity. South Carolina is a little unique as well. South Carolina has typically a 5-year cycle with a static data value. New construction can reset that data value, or a sale can reset that data value. In the absence of new construction or a sale, if you reassess a property as of the first of the year, that value normally is going to carry forward through a 5-year cycle. That next 5-year cycle generally is going to have a limit on how much they can raise that taxable value. It's a 15% cap in South Carolina, barring new construction or a sale of the taxable value. That presents a lot of inequities in terms of, again, side-by-side property owners. I might own my house for 10 years. My value is going to be limited to 15% increases from cycle to cycle. James may buy his house in mid-cycle. He gets reassessed to purchase price. He may sell his house again in 2 years. That gets reassessed to purchase price. And all of a sudden you find yourself with houses in the same neighborhood. Some are being capped, others are not. There are other states that have similar type profiles. Florida has a similar type situation where their values are in effect capped until you sell a property.
Just to follow up, to kind of follow up and dovetail on that, specifically your question being, I don't think there are any states that we deal with that I'm aware of that has a modifier, be it an indexing. That would be a good point, where you would index the market on an annual basis. Because you run into some questions about uniformity and how you treat people, and how that index was calculated. And most of those states do have provisions whereby every property gets reappraised at a certain point. That way, because all a reappraisal is basically a realignment of value. Property taxes are considered ad valorem, and that's Latin. That means of value. And so if that's what we're doing, a reappraisal should basically serve to shift, because maybe there's a property on the south end of the county that goes up 3%, and maybe there's a property on this end of the county that goes up 20%. Well, if you put an index of 3, you raise this guy's 3, this person should have went up 20, but he holds at 3, so you create these imbalances that also affects the marketplace. So most of the time, when we see this index applied, that is applied specifically to neighborhoods, but during a point where everybody is looked at. And again, the more market activity you have, the bigger the county, the more parcels you have, the more systematic you want that to be.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, Chris and James. We appreciate
Yes,
your
sir. Thank you.
information. If you have suggestions, as Representative Gardner has asked,
Yes.
and as Representative Carson has asked, if you have specific concerns or tweaks, adjustments to the statute or regulations, then we would be willing to consider those. So just submit those to us.
Thank you, sir, for letting us.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Next on our list is Mr. Steve Swindell from Cherokee County. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Again, members of GAAO, the Georgia Assessors Association in Georgia, would like to make ourselves available, as several of the speakers today have indicated. I had some prepared remarks for the last meeting, and I kind of got thrown off because the meeting ran long and everything. But the point I was trying to make in talking about the fact that many times the assessor's job is to say no to people, and that's very unpopular. The real point I wanted to make is the reason we do that, or the reason that we're put into that position, is because we understand the system. We understand the process. We understand the inherent fairness that's in the Georgia Property Tax Code. It's when things start getting manipulated and different groups or different individuals are getting benefits that maybe the rest of the tax-paying public isn't getting, that starts getting our interest from the assessment side. We're very aware, as being taxpayers ourselves, of being conducted properly, and what it takes to assure that fairness. So that's where our eye is always leaning toward in the assessment world, is always, is it fair? Are we treating everybody the same as best we can? And that's where we usually start any process that we're involved with property tax. So that's really all I came to say today, and I would welcome any questions that the committee has at this time, and we do have some other members from around the state here as well that might be able to field any questions you all might have.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Do you want to recognize those that are from your organization that with you?
We've got James Stokes, the chief appraiser from Paulding County. Trey Stevens is my deputy at Cherokee County. He's here. Stuart Oliver is behind Trey there from Gwinnett County. And we have Mr. Pruitt, the former chief appraiser from Gwinnett County, and is now doing some work with Fulton County in the back there. So,
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. Steve, nothing else, we'll move on to Roger Land and Michael Graham. Thanks, Steve.
thank you.
And these are our last two. If y'all will present together, I assume. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, to be brief, because I know the time is short, I just want to make one point. Roger Land for taxpayers across the state. If you look at the first view of the presentation that Ellen Mills put up on page 9, the total number of appeals filed,
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to point out that number is sort of a disappearing number. But for instance, let's just take 109,000 for the state. This year, 44,000 in Fulton County, 10,000 in DeKalb County. So take out 50,000, and you got roughly 59,000 appeals for 157 counties. So a lot of the problems that this committee will hear has to do with urban problems. Now, if you take, and as most everybody's testified, a large number of these appeals are BOEs. I was just talking to Gwinnett. They're running about 50% non-shows on BOEs. So now we've got 25,000 that's really the focus point, because the people with the BOEs and the residential are the ones that call their representatives and the ones that are in the most pain. The commercial people that go to BOEs, I don't think there's any problem. They know how to handle it. Fulton County is going to be Fulton County. They're an anomaly of the whole tax system and always will be. Thank you.
Mitchell, anything from you?
Well, yeah, most of what I came up with were some specific suggestions based on what I've seen, and I'll just
Okay.
submit those in writing.
That'd be good.
And one thing I just want to point out is generally is that there is a lot of good stuff in the code, which I think would help the taxpayers to have more confidence with what's going on. An example of which is there is a provision right now that counties can band together and they can have a regional board of equalization. And it's just not really done in practice. So, you know, we need to think about how we can incentivize some of the counties and some of the people to do things that are in the code, but it's not mandatory. And on the same question of incentivizing and providing accountability, the Board of Equalization, we've all talked about how it's going to be everybody's primary interaction with the system. And these are people that we can assume they want to do a good job, but they're paid $25 for the day. And so if there were some way to encourage and reward members that are, you know, doing a better job, but then you have to have a way to determine if members are doing a good job or a bad job. And so as it stands right now, there's no penalty for Board of Equalization members that are just getting it wrong. And there's no real way to track if members are getting it wrong. And by the same token, you could reward those, maybe they get $50 a day or whatever the amount is. So those are just my thoughts. The settlement conference thing, it's a good idea and it can work, but what you see in practice is that some counties will have their attorney present at the conference. A lot of them do not. If there's an attorney present, much more likely to settle. The county attorney is going to have skin in the game. And a settlement conference, the staff appraisers, there's no incentive for them to settle. You know, they have a job either way. So, just a thought there.
Okay. Questions from members of the committee?
I think that, I know it was time
Yeah.
short, but I think you just made a really good point. Whereas,
Oh, yeah, sorry.
if you have a taxpayer in a taxing jurisdiction, the taxing jurisdiction is going to have internal counsel that's going to be a sunk cost, and they don't care if it's delayed or not, to the extent that they believe that they can win the case and not have to pay the taxpayers' attorneys. Isn't that what you're saying?
Well, that's right. Yeah, and they would weigh the odds of success and, you know, understand more of the legal requirements and some of the legal problems that a county might have or a taxpayer might have. And so, you know, they would have a better judgment call on whether this should go to litigation.
Yeah.
Hey, you know, I'm all for creating more opportunities for lawyers, but
Whoa, hold on.
you know, I
didn't
appreciate
say that,
John.
Andy.
I
Come
appreciate
on.
John. Your willingness to support our guild.
CPAs, Andy.
But
CPAs.
Okay, I'm sorry, CPAs. So I was, but in all seriousness, you know, I think some of what we're trying to achieve, at least in the way the process is set up, is it's actually to avoid litigations, to get a resolution early in the process, not send this to the courts where it can get even further bogged down and actually become more costly. Driving taxpayers to the courts actually then disincentivizes their desire to even engage in the process to begin with if they know they're going to be shuttled to a court, have to hire attorneys, litigate out these issues at high cost with a very limited return on that investment. So I have some, I know I was joking, but I think the system is geared towards trying to minimize that and make it fair to taxpayers to resolve these issues early on. Sorry, I missed Mr. Greg Allen, who's here to speak on behalf of the clerk, so let me let him speak, because he's got some actual data that they have been researching and pulling together for the committee at my request. His presentation will be fairly short, and then I have a few comments to make before we close out. Okay. Those of you who do need to go ahead and go, please feel free to do so. I think Greg's information is on a handout. And what we'd asked him to do, just to cut to the chase of it, we asked him to just look at the cost of appeals that the clerks are experiencing across the state. And they have a pretty good response rating, I think about 60% response on this, which is very strong. Greg, if you'll just hit some of the points, overall points, and we'll look at these independently. We can post these on the website.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, the top there, you got the highest cost of appeal per county. We listed the top ones there. Below that's the lowest cost. Should come as no surprise. The more appeals a county may have, the lower the cost per appeal is going to be. Those numbers were also get your base cost there for training 6 BOE members. Their training, their per diem. If they have at least one hearing per year, that's going to be the cost, the bare minimum cost to a county with 6 new BOE members. Of the clerks, 81 that responded, 65 of those had less than 500 appeals per year. 16 had more than 500. Turning the page over, you'll see the big 4 counties, Cobb, Fulton, Gwinnett, and DeKalb, have the most appeals there. All 4 of those responded. Their cost per appeal is approximately $58. Composite average, that's the average of the 4 counties individually, then average together is $68. And then you'll see we have it broken down further by county population of 100,000 to 500,000, 25 to 100,000, and less than 25,000. And I think you see the cost can get enormous for the small rural counties that have to, basically their members go through the same training that the largest counties go through. They obviously don't have as many appeals. Some of the anecdotal evidence there, as you've heard from others, from Mr. Land, over half of the respondents, 50% of those that appeal do not show up for their hearings. That can be a problem because you've got disgruntled BOE members sitting around waiting on people. The hearings don't happen. The county's paying them. My county pays $75 per member per day to be the BOE member that hears the appeals. So that is one that sticks out. Additionally, 85% of those that responded said that BOE members are qualified to do their job, and that's the Department of Revenue that conducts that training and does a good job for them. And so there's really not an issue there. There is a process to remove a BOE member that is not performing or is causing issues. Of the counties that responded, 2 of the 81 have had a member removed, and that involves the clerk or the appeal administrator taking the complaints to the grand jury. The grand jury then determines if they want to remove the BOE member or not. So there is a process to remove those wild cards. So the bottom line, the largest issues are the cost in the smallest counties and the large number of no-shows that we have at our hearings.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Allen. This is helpful information. You can see that based upon those that are surveyed, $2.8 million in cost expended in this administrative process, which is fairly significant. Anything else? Anything from Mr. Allen? Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for this group from the perspective of the Superior Court?
I do not. It may be that it typically happens in my county. The larger parcels usually go with a hearing officer rather than to the BOE. And I think we as appeal administrators probably need to look at the way we schedule our hearings. I know a couple of counties have gone, though, they call it a cattle call, where they tell everybody to show up at a certain time. That way, if half the people don't show up, the BOE works through them and you get things through. I think that's something we could probably handle on our own rather than having to have legislation to do that.
Okay. Thank you. Just a few closing comments. The questions that I have remaining deal with the value of the BOE hearing process versus having hearing officers conduct those hearings. The burden shifting that is placed, how meaningful is that burden shifting where is shift to assessors to make the case and prove the case to the BOE or the hearing officer. Is that meaningful, or is it just nominal in its existence? And then the other questions that I have are, the process with the arbitrator is very interesting to me, because it does require the property owner to come forward with an appraised value, which I think in some ways requires those property owners to really do a self-assessment before they get into the hearing process. And there's a couple of other comments that have come to me from other people, is the burden on the Superior Courts, and I don't know this yet. We need to find out the information about from Superior Courts, how many cases are sitting in Superior Courts, what's the duration that they're there, how quickly are they resolved in Superior Court, and whether or not, whether or not the standard that to get to Superior Court should be one that deals with an arbitrariness in terms of the administrative assessment. Do you move to a true administrative process whereby the administrative record is built below, and that the Superior Court judge's review is just a review of that record as opposed to a de novo hearing of the entire case? Those are some tweaks and adjustments that people have raised to me before. And then whether or not maybe the Superior Court should go to a special master approach as opposed to a jury approach that's currently in statute. So I raise those just as some questions, comments for the public to think about, and maybe get some additional information on as we move through this I guess, discussion. And we look forward to the comments and the written suggestions that members of the audience have raised, and we look forward to receiving those from you. Other comments from the members of the committee? Madam Commissioner, thank you so much to Ellen and your staff for being here today and for making that presentation and being so thoroughly informative as you have been. Thank you for attending. We'll stand adjourned.